old Goretex. Or things are defined by what passes through them. I came off the hill wet to the shoulders. This requires some explanation because I am not, as a general principle, a man who comes off hills wet to the shoulders. I have views about this. I have held these views for 30 years, and they have served me adequately. The views can be stated simply: a man who selects his waterproofs with appropriate care and maintains the DWR coating with the diligence the manufacturer recommends does not come off hills wet to the shoulders. He comes off hills dry, or at worst damp in the places where exertion rather than weather is responsible. And here I must be precise, because this distinction matters. Getting wet to a limited extent from exertion is not a failure of the equipment. It is, in fact, the point of the equipment. The entire engineering achievement of the Goretex membrane was breathability. Moisture vapor generated by the body passes outward through the membrane, while liquid water is prevented from passing inward. A man who gets wet from exertion in an impermeable jacket has bought the wrong jacket. A man who gets wet from exertion in a Goretex jacket is experiencing a membrane failure. These are categorically different problems that should not be conflated. The jacket was new. This is the detail that makes the thing interesting rather than merely irritating. A man who comes off a hill wet in a jacket he has owned for 15 years has a conversation to have with himself about maintenance schedules. A man who comes off a hill wet in a jacket he bought 2 months ago has a conversation to have with the entire premise of what he thought he was buying. The label said Goretex. I have trusted that label, with justification, since the early 90s, retiring individual garments only when they no longer fitted, which is the correct order of events. The previous jacket I bought in 2014 served me without complaint for more than a decade, in conditions that would have reduced a lesser garment to a decorative sponge within the first hour. Its replacement, purchased more recently and currently dripping onto the kitchen floor, is, in the relevant technical sense, not the same thing. I looked into it in the way that wet men with opinions look into things. The answer, when it came, explained the problem without solving it. The original Goretex membrane worked because of a class of chemicals called PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, a term I deploy here not for technical display, but because the full term is doing work that the acronym cannot. These chemicals produced a membrane of exceptional performance. They also, it emerged over several decades of mounting evidence, poisoned the workers who manufactured them, and the water supply of the town of Parkersburg, West Virginia. The formula changed, as formulas do when the regulatory environment changes around them. Unfortunately, this new formula had its own disadvantages. Its performance as a material for allowing the efficient egress of sweat while maintaining a strict perimeter against precipitation changed substantially. And those of us who remembered what the old version felt like, stiff, slightly architectural, categorically impermeable, were left standing in our kitchens with wet shoulders, contemplating a name that had survived the thing it used to describe. This is, of course, a known problem. Not the PFAS specifically, but the broader condition it represents. The product that works too well is, from a certain perspective, a failed product. A jacket that lasts 30 years is a jacket sold once. A jacket that degrades politely after a decade is a jacket sold 3 times across a career. The shareholder does not benefit from the 30-year jacket, and in a system organized around the shareholder's benefit, the 30-year jacket is therefore a problem to be solved rather than an achievement to be celebrated. Alec Guinness made a film about this in 1951. The man in the white suit concerns a chemist who invents a fabric that cannot be stained and never wears out, and finds himself pursued not only by the textile industry, whose interests are obvious, but by the trade unions, whose members would have nothing to repair and nothing to replace. The film is a comedy, which tells you something about how the British processed the concept of planned obsolescence in the post-war period, which is to say, as an absurdity too large to take seriously and too structural to resist. The fabric, in the end, disintegrates. The system is preserved. Guinness walks away into the distance, presumably to invent it again. The Romans understood this problem, or rather, they failed to understand it in a way that I find instructive. Roman engineers developed a form of concrete, opus caementicium, for those keeping notes, that incorporated seawater and volcanic ash in proportions that produced, over time, a self-healing matrix. When seawater infiltrated hairline cracks in the structure, it caused the growth of mineral crystals that filled the crack and strengthened the surrounding material. The harbour wall was not merely surviving the water passing through it, it was being made stronger by it. Roman harbour walls built using this technique are still standing. They have been standing for 2,000 years. They will, on current trajectory, continue to stand for some time after the buildings currently surrounding them have been demolished and replaced several times over. Self-healing harbour walls were one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Roman Empire. And look what happened to them. There is a second species of this problem, which I find in certain respects more troubling than the first. It is not the deliberate suppression of excellence, but the accidental loss of it. Knowledge that works perfectly well until the conditions change, at which point it turns out that the practitioners knew what to do without ever understanding why, and the gap between those two things becomes, in certain circumstances, fatal. Ancient mariners knew how to prevent scurvy. They did not know that scurvy was caused by vitamin C deficiency, because vitamin C had not yet been identified as a concept. They knew that men on long voyages developed bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and a distressing tendency to die, and that this could be prevented by the consumption of citrus fruit. The Royal Navy codified this understanding in the 18th century, issuing a daily ration of grog, lemon juice and rum, to its sailors. It worked. Sailors stopped dying of scurvy at a rate that had previously been, by any reasonable measure, catastrophic. Then the steam engine was invented. Voyages became shorter, scurvy became rarer, and then effectively disappeared from the experience of serving sailors. Generations passed in which no naval surgeon had seen a case. When the knowledge was eventually needed again, in the polar expeditions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it had drifted. The Navy had switched from Mediterranean lemons, which contain substantial vitamin C, to limes from their newer colonies, which contain considerably less. The lime juice was stored and transported in copper vessels and piping, which destroys ascorbic acid with quiet efficiency. The surgeons on those expeditions were Royal Navy surgeons who had access to the full institutional history of scurvy prevention, and nonetheless watched their men develop the symptoms without connecting them to the cause. They had the label. They had lost the substance. The new Goretex jacket says Goretex on the label. I have no reason to doubt this. It is, in the technical and legal sense, Goretex. It has simply, across a series of incremental reformulations driven by regulatory pressure and shareholder expectation, become lime juice in a copper pipe. Standing there, dripping, I found myself thinking about a tent. A chute is a tactical exercise without troops. A thing the army does when it wishes to train officers in the planning and execution of operations without the administrative inconvenience of deploying actual soldiers into the field to conduct them. The officers go out onto the ground, decide how they would deploy forces, deliver their orders, and retire to a base area to be debriefed on the quality of their thinking. Our function, on the day in question, was the base area. Specifically, we were responsible for the tents. The tents were large canvas structures of the type that the army was still issuing in the mid-90s for field exercises in the Scottish hills. They were not, to be clear, bad tents. They were excellent tents, of a kind that had sheltered soldiers in conditions of genuine severity and emerged from those conditions with their reputation intact. They required, for their erection, a frame of scaffolding gauge poles, a set of mallets, a quantity of pegs, and conditions that did not include a sustained gale off the hills. Alas, the conditions this particular day included a sustained gale off the hills. Major Erskine, this was not his name, but it preserves the approximate cadence of the original without compromising the privacy of a man who deserves better, was a Royal Artillery officer serving as a training major. He seemed old to us then, in the way that anyone with actual experience seems old to people who have not yet acquired any. He can have been, at most, the age I am now, which I offer without further comment. He had the appearance of a man for whom the army had been a mild and not unpleasant surprise. Slight, unhurried, possessed of a quality of quiet that one initially mistakes for mildness and later revises. He had served in the Falklands as a forward observation officer, a role that involves directing artillery fire onto enemy positions from an exposed forward location, which is the kind of detail that recontextualizes a man's quietness considerably. He had mentioned this once in a talk he gave us, and had not mentioned it again. The talk had covered his foo role in the campaign, the particular geography of the ground, and the detail, offered in passing in the same register he used for everything else, that his Basha partner had shared his name exactly. The coincidence had apparently been a source of some comment at the time. His Basha partner had been shot through the hand during the fighting. Erskine had not been shot at all, a fact he appeared to have filed somewhere between relief and guilt in the drawer that experienced soldiers reserve for outcomes that were not distributed fairly. We got the first tent up. This was not straightforward. The wind was already making its views known, and there was a period during which the operation resembled less a piece of organised military engineering and more a group of men engaged in a vigorous argument with a large piece of canvas about who was in charge. The canvas made several strong counter-arguments. We prevailed, eventually, through the application of sufficient manpower and stubbornness, and by the time the pegs were in and the first tent was standing, we had developed a confidence in our collective abilities that the afternoon had not yet finished forming its opinion of. Inside, Major Erskine had set up tables. There was a Norwegian container. A Norwegian container, not to be confused with the Norwegian shirt, which is a different piece of kit entirely, and the source of its own category of military misunderstanding, is an insulated vessel of considerable capacity, used by the army to transport food or drink in either a hot or cold state with equal efficiency, dispensed via a tap on the side. Major Erskine had indicated that there were spuds in it, and that we should help ourselves. I opened the lid. "What are you doing?" I explained, with mild confusion, that I was getting the spuds. Major Erskine spotted my misconception at once. Spuds, in the army, is Bovril. It is not, has never been, and was not on this occasion, potatoes. It is a hot beef extract drink, consumed from a mug, served from a Norwegian container whose lid is not to be opened without operational necessity, because doing so affects the duration for which the contents remain at a serviceable temperature. Major Erskine explained this with the patience of a man who has recalibrated his understanding of what constitutes a crisis through direct experience in the South Atlantic. A young soldier opening the wrong end of a hot beverage container does not make the list. I ceased attempting to open the lid. He directed my attention to the tap on the side, which I resisted the urge to state I had in fact actually noticed previously, but concluded the potatoes I had been expecting would not fit through. We turned to the second tent. The wind, in the interval between completing the first and beginning the second, had revised its position upward. There were 10 of us. The poles assembled with the satisfying logic of a system designed by someone who had actually thought about it, which briefly gave us renewed confidence that our luck masquerading as engineering talent would hold through the construction of this second group shelter. The canvas went over. 10 men held it down while the gale registered its updated position on the matter. The problem was the pegs. Pegging requires a free hand, and the hands were occupied with the canvas, and releasing the canvas to begin pegging was the kind of decision that required someone to go first. There was a pause of the type that occurs when 10 people have simultaneously understood that the first man to move has accepted a liability the others have not. One man let go. The tent, which had until that moment been a tent, became a kite. The physics of this transition were immediate and without appeal. 9 men holding a large canvas structure in a gale are insufficient. The canvas went up. The 9 men went with it, to the extent that letting go had not yet registered as an available option for 9 people whose instinct was to hold on to the thing they had been holding. We rose collectively to the height at which the wind's intentions became unambiguous. The sensible response, which most of us arrived at within a second or two, was to release the canvas. The tent took off. A scaffolding gauge pole, the kind of object not given to bending under ordinary circumstances, was found afterwards to be irretrievably deformed, which gave some indication of the forces involved and a degree of retrospective context for how quickly the sensible response needed to have been arrived at. One of our number, Jamie, did not let go. Jamie was not a foolish man, and I want to be clear about that. He was capable and conscientious, and the grip that kept him attached to the canvas as the ground receded was not the grip of a man who had failed to understand the situation. It was the grip of a man who had understood it slightly too late, and who had, in the interval between understanding it and acting on that understanding, arrived at a height from which letting go had acquired a different set of implications. We grabbed his ankles. We pulled him down. He came down. He released the canvas when the ground was close enough to make releasing it the obvious conclusion, which is perhaps a beat later than the optimal moment, but considerably earlier than the undesirable alternative. The tent, now unencumbered by human ballast, covered approximately 100 metres of Scottish hillside before we caught it. This required 10 men to sprint after a quantity of canvas and scaffolding poles in a gale, rugby tackle the thing to the ground as a collective and drag it back to the first tent by main force. It was installed in the corner, where it sat for the remainder of the exercise, with the settled indifference of an object that has caused a near fatality and has no particular feelings about this. Major Erskine observed all of this from a short distance. He said nothing for a moment, then noted that Bovril was available for anyone that wanted any, but no potatoes, he added thoughtfully. Some decades after the Spuds tent kite incident, I was working for a consultancy. The nature of the consultancy is not relevant to what follows, and is in any case the kind of detail that benefits from vagueness. What is relevant is that during the period in question, COVID lockdown, which compressed everyone into their screens and taught us all to confuse the medium of communication with the act of it, much of the organization's internal life was conducted via Teams. This was not, in itself, a problem. It was simply the condition of that particular moment, and most things that needed communicating got communicated adequately enough. I received a group message late on a Friday afternoon. I was expecting at that point in the week a particular kind of message, something technical, something requiring a response in my area of professional expertise. The lateness and length of the message communicated the importance before I had read a single word. The brain, when it is waiting for that kind of information, configures itself accordingly. It opens in that mode that processes operational problems, open, receptive, a tabula rasa, scanning for relevant detail, framing the question, preparing to begin working toward a solution. This is ordinarily a useful mode for the expected scenario of problem solving. It is not the right mode for everything. The message informed us that Colin was no longer with us. Colin, this is not his name, but the name will serve, was a colleague I had known well enough to have a clear picture of. Capable, good company, a former infantryman who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and carried whatever he had carried from those places with the same ease he carried everything else, which is to say, you did not see it unless you knew to look. The message was a wall of text from HR on a Friday afternoon, and it arrived in the wrong brainhole entirely. There is no actionable detail in that kind of news. The brain, finding none, does something unhelpful, which is to keep looking. It is like pouring information into the wrong vessel. The shape of the container does not match the shape of what is being poured into it, and what cannot be contained overflows into the rest of one's mind, leaving behind a residue that one does not fully account for until considerably later. I sat with it for some time before the mode shifted, and by the time it did, the moment in which it should have been received had already passed. Colin had not let go of the tent kite that his personal experiences represented in time. And, unlike Jamie that day on the hill, did not have 9 comrades on hand to bring him back to earth. He did not seek a friendly ear, nor share his burden over a cup of spuds. He had been holding on to things that the ground had long since receded from, and the weight of them, in the end, was more than the holding could sustain. I have thought about the format of that message more than I have thought about most things in the years since. The army, for all its ability to inflict damage, including on those that it employs, always understood at least the importance of a face and a voice when the news was of a certain kind. The consultancy had not thought about this, or had thought about it and concluded that a group message on a Friday afternoon was adequate, which amounts to the same thing. There is a way of thinking about rivers that I find pertinent. People tend to think of a river, understandably, as a body of water, the Thames, the Taff, the particular stretch of hill water that a man crosses on a walk in Goretex that no longer performs as advertised. Ask a person to describe a river, they will say they are snake-like patches of wet. But consider this. Where is the water that was here yesterday? It has moved through, onwards and outwards. The water does not stay, yet the river remains. Which makes one consider what a river actually is. As established, it is not the water, which is transient, merely passing through. The river is not therefore the water itself, but the thing defined by the water's passage. People are no different. We are not the sum total of the experiences we pass through. We are what is left when those experiences have passed. Either strengthened by the experience like a Roman concrete harbour wall, or damaged by it like a tent pole in a gale. Erskine, so far as I knew him, understood this. He had been in the Falklands. He had carried something back from it that he mentioned once, in a tone calibrated to inform without dwelling, then had got on with things. The weird experience of having a named doppelganger as a basher buddy that fared less well through the same adversities could have set him on many roads. But the one it actually set him on ended, on the day our paths crossed, with a norgie full of spuds and some soldiers that were better informed about the adversities the profession entails for having met him. My erstwhile colleague, Colin, had served in conflicts just as hard as Major Erskine's, for years rather than months. His road did not, sadly, have so constructive an ending. What mark his experiences left I cannot say, for he never confided them to me. I wish he had, or at least to someone. Jamie, at head height, could not deal with the tent kite problem alone. He needed his friends to grab his ankles and pull him back to earth. He needed them to do the thing he could not do for himself, which was to restore the distance between him and the ground to something manageable. This is not a complicated observation. It is, in my experience, a true one. The man in the air is not always able to assess his own altitude. The people on the ground can see it clearly. The only question is whether they reach out in time.